Chapter 20. The Carpews have a boarder. That village with the old Norman church, and the bleak, wind-blown churchyard, where the graves were sometimes washed by the salt, white spray from a stormy sea, consisted only of about half a dozen stone cottages, and the congregation which sparsely occupied the old oaken pews on a Sunday morning and afternoon was mostly made up of smock-frock farmers from the neighbourhood, or an occasional pitman's family, which had come over the hill to afternoon service for the sake of the walk. Poor as the parish was, and few the dwellings it contained, there were a vicarage and a vicar. The vicarage, a low, rambling house with stone walls and slated roof, over which lichens and stonecrop had spread a friendly covering. The vicar, an elderly, careworn man, whose shoulders seemed to have bent under the burden of a large family. This gentleman, with his wife and children, were the only people with any pretence to gentility within a longish walk from the Norman church, and although Mrs. Carpew, the vicar's wife, had grown worn and wan with domestic cares, and rarely enjoyed 10 minutes' leisure between breakfast and bedtime, she had not yet left off lamenting the want of society in the neighbourhood. What leisure or entertainment she could have given to society, or what gowns she could have worn in society, had society been there, was a problem which she had never tried to solve. She went on lamenting the barrenness of the neighbourhood with a certain ladylike forlornness which secured her the sympathy of friendly farmers' wives, with whom she occasionally condescended to partake of a substantial north country tea. If this poor lady could afford herself one reputable gown and one smart bonnet in which to appear at such homely tea-drinkings, she thought herself happy, for there were 3 growing girls to be clad and shod, and there was an eldest son at Durham, and a second son at Marlborough, and 2 small boys running wild at home, whom the vicar was supposed to teach, so that in the long vacation, very long seemed that vacation to the house-mother, there were 7 hungry mouths round the vicarage table, to say nothing of the father and mother, who almost lost all appetite in horror at the amount of food these 7 hungry maws consumed. "A little more beef, please, Ma." "A little more pudding, please, Ma." What a chorus it was! Mrs. Carpew had much need to comfort herself with the vulgar aphorism that it is better to pay butcher and baker than doctor and chemist, but that consolatory reflection did not tend to make the bills lower. If it wasn't for their boarder, the Carpews would never be able to make both ends meet, said the farmers' wives, who knew how poor a living this parish of St. Jude's provided for its pastor. There was a boarder at the vicarage, a mysterious gentleman boarder, whose face but few of the neighbours had ever beheld, but whose existence in the house was not made an absolute secret, although it was talked about as little as possible. "It is beneath your father's position as vicar for us to have a boarder, so the less you say about him the better, dears," Mrs. Carpew told her brood. "He is a poor, afflicted creature, and it is a charity to take care of him." The young Carpews were so far of the world worldly as to be able to act upon this maternal counsel. The words boarder and afflicted were equally hateful to them, and never passed their lips. Affliction, in that sense, meant to their young minds something revolting and horrible to look upon, and they would have walked miles to avoid meeting the boarder who lived under the same roof with them. All that these younger members of the family knew of the unseen occupant was that he lived in a portion of the house that had been added by a former vicar, a man of sporting tastes and of larger means than the present incumbent, a squire's son from the Lake District, whose father owned a good deal of property near Keswick, and who could afford to indulge himself with a kennel of shooting dogs, a well-filled gun-room, and as many jovial bachelor friends as he cared to entertain in the shooting season. Altogether a very different type of man from Ebenezer Carpew, who had struggled out of the dismal swamp of nonconformity into the loftier atmosphere of the Church of England via Durham, and who had never recovered from the effects of the struggle. The wing added to the vicarage early in the century by the bachelor parson consisted of 4 good-sized rooms affording ample accommodation for an afflicted gentleman, even if he were, as the neighbours insisted, a sprig of nobility. 4 rooms, locked off from the rest of the house, were reserved for the unknown, and it was the popular idea that the unknown was not right in his mind, and had been confided to Mr. Carpew's care by his relatives, not right, but not so wrong as to render his residence in Mr. Carpew's house illegal. St. Jude's Vicarage was so remote from civilization, such a lonely and isolated nook along that bleak Cumbrian coast, that questions which might have been asked in any other neighbourhood were not asked here. The village of St. Jude was less than a mile from Allen Bay, and while prosecuting her inquiries among the little group of fishermen's cottages clustered on one side of the bay, Lady Penrith heard of the mysterious inmate of St. Jude's Vicarage, but beyond the mere fact of his existence, her informant could tell her nothing. "Nobody ever sees him," said a fisherman's wife, who was aunt to the servant girl at the vicarage. "Mr. and Mrs. Carpew wait on him theirselves, the girl told me. Take him his food and clean up his room and look after him. They're too poor to keep a servant on purpose, and the girl, it was my own niece, Mary Martin. She was over 2 years at the vicarage and never see him all that time. Said Mrs. Carpew told her that she was to hold her tongue and say nothing about him to nobody, and she didn't, except to me and 2 or 3 others as she'd known from a baby." "What kind of man is Mr. Carpew?" Lady Penrith asked thoughtfully. "Well, your ladyship, he's what I would call a poor creature. There's no grit in him. He's regular broke down with trouble and care, all those hungry boys and girls to feed, always in debt to the butcher or baker. They say the livin' ain't worth more than £170 a year, all told, and there's 9 in their family, the youngsters all growing up hearty, and the servant girl makes 10. Poor Mrs. Carpew works her fingers to the bone, sewing and helping with the housework. If ever there was a white slave, she's one, poor lady, but I think she's got more spirit than the vicar, and bears up better." "Does nobody help them?" "The farmers' wives, they helps a bit, with a couple of chickens now and then, or a pound or 2 of butter and a score of eggs, but it don't go far. There's no gentry near enough to take any interest in. They're not like regular poor folks, you see, my lady. They can't ask for help, or else I daresay they would have asked up the castle, for it was the old lord who gave Mr. Carpew the living, such as it is." "His lordship's father? That must have been a long time ago." "Yes, my lady, it must be nigh upon 25 years. Mr. Carpew was tutor at the castle before Lord Ardliston and his brother went to college. Ah, he used to have fine times then, poor gentleman. His back was straight enough in these days, and he was quite smart in his dress, and held himself ever so high. Life was almost a pleasure for him then. He used to racket about at all the race meetings in the neighbourhood with the young lord and his brother. He's not as old a man as you'd think, looking at him now, and I don't believe he's more than 6 or 7 years older than Lord Penrith. And they were good friends, no doubt, he and his pupils. Ah, yes, they was very good friends, him and Mr. Urquhart in particular. His lordship was always high, my lady, even when he was Lord Ardliston. But Mr. Urquhart, he allus made more free with folks, and he and Mr. Carpew was a good deal about together. They say the vicar was a great scholar in those days. He'd been helped on at college because of his talents, and people said the Earl was lucky to find a man in the neighbourhood ready to his hand. Mr. Carpew's father was a dissenting minister at Workington, a small tradesman that had taken to preaching in a little chapel up a back lane. So you may suppose it wasn't no easy matter for him to send his son to Durham College. How long has the person your niece spoke about been at the vicarage? Asked Lady Penrith, after a thoughtful silence. Ah, that's more than I can say, my lady. I don't suppose anyone knows when he came here, or that anyone see him come, but he's been there a long while. 20 years? I can't say, my lady. It's 4 years or more since Mary told me about him, and she was at the vicarage going on for 3 years, and he was there all the time, though she never laid eyes on him, and that's all I know. Do you think there is anyone here or at St. Jude's who knows more about him? No, I don't, my lady, for we've talked it over among ourselves here and up at St. Jude's, and if there'd been anything more to hear, I should have heard it. They've kept it all very close, the Carpews have, but we all know that if the vicar didn't get a little money behind his wage as parson, him and his'n must have been famished. When Coralie saw the pony carriage disappear over the crest of the hill, Lady Penrith was on her way to St. Jude's to make a formal call at the vicarage. That seemed the simplest manner of approaching the Carpew mystery in the first place, and she put a strain upon herself to suppress all signs of agitation, and to appear with the manner of a person interested only in the case of possible distress. The mysterious message delivered to her on the moor was a sufficient excuse for pushing her inquiries to the furthest limits, and as the wife of the patron of the living she was at least entitled to respect from the vicar and his family. Indeed, her conscience smote her at the thought that she had been living within a dozen miles of genteel poverty such as this, and had done nothing to brighten these poor people's lives. Her first attempt was baffled by Mrs. Carpew's abject terror of being discovered in her untidy parlour and her worse than shabby gown. The Iceland ponies, neat little cart, and smart groom had been visible to the vicar's wife from the windows of her bedroom, where she had been engaged the whole afternoon in a favourite species of occupation which she called a good turn-out, which involved the emptying of drawers and closets, old trunks and old bandboxes, and piling up the shabby raiment on the bed, a proceeding lengthened by the minutest investigation of said raiment, and much discussion with her eldest daughter, now old enough to be admitted to the strictly feminine rites of the turn-out, as to the possible rehabilitation of certain garments which had been put by as hopeless, or the conversion of last year's finery to this year's fashion, the fashion as known at St. Jude's, which was 2 years behind London and 15 months behind Edinburgh. From an open window, mother and daughter saw the Penrith pony carriage approaching. "It's Lady Penrith," cried Miss Carpew. "I saw her driving those ponies the last time I was at Ardliston. To think of her coming to call on us after all these years, and we not fit to be seen. Do be quick, Ma, and wash your face and smooth your hair. You look dreadful, and so do I," glancing at her own heated countenance in the cloudy glass on the littered dressing-table. "Gertrude, we can't see her," exclaimed Mrs. Carpew. "It's out of the question. The boys are in the drawing-room. I looked in just before I came upstairs. Luke and Jack were playing double dummy, and Joe was washing Snapper in a tub by the fire. He will wash that dog in the drawing-room. Run down to Sarah and say, 'Not at home.'" "It seems a pity," faltered Gertrude, lingering on the threshold. "If we say 'not at home' to-day, she may never come again, and she may have come to ask us to a party." "Not she! What, after her being at the castle off and on nearly 10 years? She's only come to bother about some of the poor people, I dare say. Perhaps to complain of something, to find fault with your father for not going to see them when they're ill. Miles and miles on a winter night. Run, Gertie, this instant," cried the vicar's wife, almost hysterically, as the grinding of the wheels drew near upon the hard chalk road. "As if he could go out on cold nights with his asthma," concluded Mrs. Carpew, grumbling, to the empty air. Gertrude rushed downstairs 3 steps at a time, after her manner, and reached the kitchen passage just as the groom rang the bell. "Not at home. Nobody at home," she gasped to the maid-of-all-work. "Wipe your face as you go along the passage, do, for goodness' sake. It's all over blacks." Gertie dropped into a chair by the fire as the girl hurried out, scrubbing her dirty face with an apron as dirty, and burst into tears. "How horrid it all is," she moaned, "to be obliged to hide from well-dressed people, as if one was a murderer. I wish I was in one of the colonies, where there are no fine ladies, no pony carriages, nothing to belittle one and make one feel wretched. I wish I was dead, or married to Steve Maltby." Stephen Maltby was the son of a small tenant farmer, whose comfortable homestead Mrs. Carpew visited condescendingly, and whose honourable advances to Miss Carpew had been flouted by her parents. "If you want to sink into the class out of which I raised myself by the most strenuous toil, you had better marry Stephen Maltby," said the vicar severely. Gertrude felt in her heart of hearts that she had better marry Stephen, without any retrospective considerations, but she submitted as a dutiful daughter. Stephen was tall and good-looking, but his hair was decidedly sandy, and she was not so much in love with him as to defy father and mother for his sake. So she told herself that, wretched as life was at the vicarage, she did not want to lose caste and to sink to the level of a tenant farmer's wife. She heard the hall door shut, and the slow slipshod feet of Sarah returning along the passage. The vicarage spread itself over a good deal of ground, and the drawing-room where the vicar's sons were playing whist was at some distance from these rooms, which the sporting vicar of 50 years before had built on the east side of the house, abutting on a walled garden of about an acre. This garden, with its fir trees and shrubberied walk on one side, and its old apple trees, rose bushes, and asparagus beds on the other, had been the pleasure and the pride of the previous vicar and his wife. But Mrs. Carpew was too harassed and hard driven by the stress of daily life to take any pride in anything, and Mr. Carpew seemed to have lost all interest in life, except a feeble concern as to what horse was likely to win any great race, a subject he would discuss with his sons or his neighbours with a faint revival of human feeling. For the rest, he was like a man whose spirit had gone out of him years before, who only moved about automatically, a mindless, nerveless body. "What did she say?" asked Gertie, meeting Sarah at the kitchen door. "She seemed regular put out when I told her there wasn't nobody at home. She asked first for the vicar, and then for the missus, and then if there were any member of the family as she could see, and I says no, you was every one of you out. And then she asked when Master and Missus was likely to be at home, and I says to-morrow afternoon, for I thinks if Missus knows beforehand, she can red up things a bit." Yes, of course, that was very sensible of you, Sarah. "And then she says she will come to-morrow at about 3 o'clock. So now you know what you've got to do, Miss Gertrude. And there mustn't be no washing dogs in the drawing-room." "No, nor yet those horrid cards. As if the evening wasn't long enough for whist, when they can have me and Lilian instead of double dummy." "Lady Penrith must have made up her mind to know us," mused the vicar's daughter as she ran up to her garret bedroom to take a last look at her ladyship's pony-cart. "Perhaps she has heard how hard it is for us to live here without society, and means to be our friend." She opened her lattice and put her head out into the autumn wind. There was no sign of the pony-cart, not even a cloud of dust in the direction where she had first looked, and then, sweeping the landscape, her eyes descried groom and ponies stationed a little way off, in the opposite direction, eastward toward the Scottish border, and, behold, the pony-cart was empty. Gertie ran to another dormer at the east end of the house, which commanded garden and common land beyond, and from this lookout she beheld Lady Penrith standing far off on the steep heather-clad slope which rose outside the garden wall, evidently looking at the house and its surroundings. Gertie watched her for 10 minutes or so, and saw her walking slowly about the hillside, and looking from time to time at the vicarage, while Gertie, fearful of being seen at her post of observation, screened herself behind the faded chintz curtain. End of chapter 20.